Please welcome Jay Stringer.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's good to be with you. I got up at 2:30 Seattle time, so I'm going to try and get my body ready to go. So where I'm going to begin today is to introduce you all to three men. And so I'll start with Matteo. So Matteo is 28 years old. He's a recent graduate of New York University and got a job at WeWork pretty recently, and he's involved with The Block, which is the college ministry of Hillsong. And he was dating a woman for about 2 years that he thought they might get married, but she discovered pornography on his phone twice, and that slowly began to erode the trust that they had in the relationship. So he moved on. And then essentially just began hooking up with various people. And what he kept finding is that anytime he got in a relationship for over a month, he found the emotional commitment in him just kind of completely die off. So he was getting a beer with a friend. They were talking through what's your dynamic with women. And he talked about, like, I just can't imagine being married with someone and having to spend the rest of my life with one woman on Friday nights and it just be the two of us. That sucks. So then he talked about with pornography, there's not much required of him, and so these are the things that he kind of goes to. So he came in to see me and wanted to discuss some of these dating dynamics. And one of the things that he disclosed, one of the things that I often ask men when they're coming in to see me for pornography addiction, buying sex, affairs is to not just tell me that you're struggling, because we know that in a room like this, 70% of us are looking at pornography. But what we don't always think about are what are the actual search terms that we put into our phone when we're actually scanning the internet. Because these search terms are actually highly revelatory of either our past life, our childhood issues, or highly revelatory of the situation that we're in right now. So that's Matteo. Next man's name is Ben. So Ben is in his early 40s. He's married. He has 2 kids. He's involved in commercial real estate. And from what I've gotten to know from Ben, it's a pretty cutthroat world. And so he came in to see me because he had a pretty emotionally abusive boss that he was really disturbed by, causing him a lot of anxiety. And the week that he came into therapy, he started talking about he's also an assistant boys varsity coach of a team out in Brooklyn, and he had one of his basketball players' dad call him and basically just berated him for why his son didn't get into a D1 school. So comes into therapy and tells me a lot about like his current stressors, and he says, but the real reason I'm here is I've had a porn addiction since I was 17. So again, after a couple sessions where I get to know him, I begin to ask him, like, tell me a little bit about what your search is. And he just looked down for about 20 seconds and then raises his head back up and said, I'm really disturbed by what I look at. And what he went on to disclose was that he often puts in teen searches or people with smaller body types. He gets into race and Asian fetishes, and so he said, I have no idea why I'm doing this, but what I've recognized is that the pornography that I'm looking at right now as a 40-year-old is very different than what I started when I was 17. And he said, if I don't get some help right now, I'm afraid that there's going to be more degradation, more perversion. He said, I don't understand this at all, but I need some help to understand it. So that's Ben. Next man's name is Jonathan, and Jonathan is a professor at Columbia. He's been married to his wife for 18 years. This is his second marriage, and he has 1 child from a previous marriage. He was recently getting a routine physical with his physician, and he said, you know what, I probably need to order a sexually transmitted infection test. And so the doctor said, of course, and then also kind of clued into the reality that he had some shame about asking for that and said, do you have anyone that you can talk to about what you're going through? And he said, I don't. So I get the referral, and he comes into my office, and part of what he discloses to me is that he has been buying sex for most of his adult life. And what he goes on to tell me is that he started back in the day kind of driving on Roosevelt Avenue in Queens and just trying to scan the streets for women in prostitution. And he says he does this on business trips as well, where he'll rent a car, and that's what he's doing. He's always going to different cities or New York, and he's trying to make eye contact with people. And so he said he can drive around, cruise around for hours, just trying to get the right look for someone. He will also get pretty heavily involved in people's escorts, people that he meets on Backpage. He'll invest in furniture for them, careers for them. And so it's one of those things that, again, he came in and realized that, I guess the feds busted an underground brothel network in Manhattan last year, and he got really anxious that he was going to end up in the paper and lose his job. So these are just a little bit of, they're made-up stories. They're also real stories. But these are the types of people that come to see me. And if I shouldn't have done that yet. So if my research is correct, there are Mateos, Bens, and Jonathans in our room this morning. And I'm in this work because I believe that God is neither surprised nor ashamed of the behaviors that we participate in, but actually understands them to be the very stage through which the work of redemption is going to be played out in our lives. So what I find in the scriptures is that whenever God engages people, God is extremely curious. So to Adam, what does he say? Adam, where are you? To Jacob, what is your name again? To Cain, why are you angry? And to Hagar, where do you come from and where are you going? So if we're understanding the voice of God as it relates to our sexual struggles and temptations and fantasies and buying sex and watching sex, we should really begin to ponder if we're hearing the curious and kind voice of God about what's going on in our lives. That it's much more, where do you come from, where are you going? And we see this pattern throughout the scriptures where God sends his word to create creation. God sends his Shekinah glory. He sends his son. He takes up flesh and blood into the very places of human struggle. God is always tabernacling in places of weakness throughout the scripture. And so if we're to expect the arrival of God in our lives, how can we expect it to be anywhere else but in the very nature of our struggle? So God cannot but help send his spirit, his presence, his people into our lives precisely in the places that we struggle. And yet what I find so often with Christian men is that we're so often trying to tell God, I'm sorry that I'm lusting, I'm sorry that I'm doing this, rather than to actually pause and just listen to what our behavior, what our fantasies actually might be trying to communicate to us. And so what I found in my work over the last decade is that our sexual fantasies and behaviors are never random or capricious. There is always a reason. And if you want freedom from this stuff, you have to begin to identify your unique reasons for pursuing the search terms and the behaviors. Does that make sense? Okay. And so what I find is that men are we're far more likely to be ashamed of our sexual behavior when we do not understand them. So I set out to kind of try and prove this through doing a research project. And I developed a research instrument of about 100 questions to survey men and women of what was your relationship to your mom, your dad. Tell me about the early childhood experiences of sexual abuse, of bullying, all of that kind of stuff. And then I wanted to know that your precise search terms, like what do you actually search the internet for? So like, for example, the number one search for term last year in pornography was stepmom. So I began to kind of ask, what are some of the questions that people are actually pursuing? And then tell me about what you're dealing with in life right now. Are you feeling depression? Are you feeling purposelessness? So I was expecting to get about 300 or 400 participants and ended up partnering with a lot of major organizations, Fight the New Drug, Covenant Eyes, XXX Church, and we got about 4,000 participants to this study. And one of the first, I haven't gotten all the research yet. I got a team at New York University that are handling all the research, but one of the initial findings is that you are 300 times more likely to pursue more pornography and escalate your pornography use when you're experiencing shame for your sexual behavior. So what I'm always trying to do with men is to really invite them to what is the story, because there are so many stories hidden within our fantasies, whether you're conscious of them or not. And so what I'm going to share with you all this morning is some of the research of how do these men, Mateo, Ben, and Jonathan, get to where they are. And so what we find is that there's actually 4 pretty key drivers of what happens in childhood. And I'm just taking one slice of the pie. I could come back and talk about entitlement. I could talk about stress and just being New Yorkers and like all the stuff that you deal with money, power, influence, narcissism, whole different lecture. So what I'm going to kind of address today are really what are the key drivers that set this stuff up. So the first driver is that of disengagement. And this is the reality that when care is overlooked in our lives. So just to give you all a sense of the scale of disengagement in America, there were 2.3 million cases of childhood maltreatment last year. 2/3 or 3/4 of that involved disengagement or kind of emotional detachment from a parent to a child. So this is a really big issue. So if you begin to think about just the story of Genesis, Adam is walking in the cool of the day with Adam. And even when Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden, God's presence cannot but help follow them. So Yahweh sends himself to go and find them. And so what you're dealing with really with disengagement is you've been through some stuff in childhood, but you never knew that there was a mom, a dad, a community of people that actually cared for you. So when you go back to middle school and you start thinking about all the hell that happens to us, were there people that you could talk to in the midst of that? And if you didn't, you grew up in a disengaged family. And so what happens in disengagement is that this actually creates really fertile territory for lust to emerge, because you're always scanning the world wondering if someone's going to care for you. And then you end up marrying someone that you think is going to be able to care for you, but usually she's looking for someone that she thinks might be able to engage her well, and you're not built for it. And so you end up getting married. She might have her own addiction processes. She might have a hunger for relationship, but you don't know how to meet it. And so you're always kind of out there scanning. And so what my research found is that people who have come from disengaged families are actually 2 times more likely to say that they are depressed and their needs are not met, and they are 2 times more likely to have affairs. The next category is that of rigidity, and this is when rules become weapons. So these aren't like rules that are like barriers around the Grand Canyon that are intended to keep you from falling in. They are really set up to shame you. They're scarlet letters. And so this is like when you go through experiences in life where it could be just overt violence, like you knew that your mom, your dad had a belt for you if you were to act out, but it could also be just religious rigidity of, I can't believe you're doing that, or your parents would kind of look away or always required you to be perfectly spiritual and would ground you if you ever had a temper. So it's really this, you're growing up in a family where there's so much rigidity. And just to give you all an example of this, so I have at the time of this story, I have had a 3-year-old son. He's 4 now, and he loves almond milk. So whenever my wife and I are making a cocktail, having a beer, having champagne, he wants almond milk and a champagne flute and a cocktail coupe, and he's always, like, from the time that he was young, he's like, more almond milk. And so this is like his favorite thing. So we have some family in town over Thanksgiving, and he gets up from the couch, we're all in the living room, and then we hear the fridge open, and we hear some tinkering around, and he's old enough to get his own almond milk. We let him do that. But he's taking a little bit longer, and so my brother-in-law, Dave, gets up, and he walks into the kitchen, and what he sees is this 3-year-old with an 11-inch butcher knife trying to open up the seal of the almond milk. And in that moment, Dave says, "Amos, stop!" And in that moment, like, everything got really quiet. Amos put down the knife and then ran into my arms, and then his body just started shaking. And after about 3 or 4 minutes, my wife is a therapist as well, so Amos was actually identifying, like, this is shame, which, like, well done, son. What he went on, and it was in that safety. So that's what Alan Shore calls the break. So all of us are always curious. Like we as kids are always trying to get into anything and everything, right? But we do need a break. We need a stop. You're about to go off a cliff. Stop. You're about to open up a almond milk container with a butcher knife. Don't do that. But in rigid families, that stop. What are you doing? Don't ever do that. You're such an idiot. That's much more the language. And so the break is applied, and you don't have anyone's arms to run into. And so what we find in the research here within rigidity is that really you struggle with anger because you're seeing so much hypocrisy in the family system, right? You're seeing that, dad has all these rules, mom has all these rules, but they're really just empty, narcissistic human beings. And they judge me, and they hate me, and then they try and act like everything is okay, and we go back to church. And so you're watching so much hypocrisy, and the response to that is so much anger. And so what my research shows is that you're 2.3, if you had a strict mother, you were 2.3 times more likely to look at pornography that was really about the subordination of other people. So you wanted smaller body types, you wanted more racial fetishes, you wanted basically someone that you could have power over. And so again, this makes sense, right? So Jesus is always describing sin as a matter of lust and anger, that when we lust, we commit adultery. When we're angry, we're murder. And that's so much of the intersection of pornography is it's not just lust. It's far more lust might start the engine, but anger is really the thing that keeps this thing moving. The next category is triangulation, and this is when you're married to mom. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one other than to say the classic setup is evangelical household, successful father, really involved with his career, successful lawyer, architect, doctor, doing a lot with his career, and the man abdicates his emotional responsibility to his wife. And in the midst of that, the child, in some ways, has to begin to pick up the slack. And so the mom will often confide in the son, bringing a lot of her emotional life to him. And this could happen with your dad as well, that he could tell you, I'm struggling with mom in this way, I'm struggling here. So it's this identity that you always realize, I have an identity in reference to their needs, but you don't actually know that there's someone that cares about what you're going through. So triangulation. What my research finds here is if your mom or dad confided in you, you were 2 times more likely to repeat this type of enactment later. So you would search the internet for larger body types, mothers, you would search it for teachers, basically people that were older than you, that had more power in the pornography scene, in order to repeat some of these patterns. And then the final category is that of sexual abuse. And this is basically when desire becomes corrupted. So just, again, go back to those statistics. 78% come from a rigid family, 87% come from a disengaged family. So if you don't have a secure attachment as a man, you're vulnerable. And every abuser, whether it's a peer, a neighbor down the street, your grandfather, your dad, your mom, your babysitter, someone at prep school, they know this about you. They know that there's an emptiness to you. They know that you haven't been pursued. And so every abuser begins with a grooming process where they begin to introduce kindness to you. Oftentimes, is that they initially say, you're really great at sports, or you have a great voice. They get you to laugh. And so when we laugh, when we're pursued, when we're touched in a kind way, when we're given a hug by someone older or just someone that cares about us, our body releases oxytocin. But every groomer is also trying to introduce you to porn. They're also trying to bring you to sexual arousal. They're trying to get you to arouse them. And so your body begins to release cortisol, which is a stress hormone that says, I don't know about this situation. Should I be this? I don't know what to do. But as abusers continue their craft, they want your pleasure. They want you to begin to be aroused by their pornography too. They want you to touch them. They want to touch you to make you complicit in the abuse. And so this is what Patrick Carnes calls the recreation of trauma is the biggest sexual hit of all that any of us can receive. And so if you're going through early childhood experiences where this is your first sexual template of I'm feeling like someone cares about me, I'm bonding with them, but I'm also stressed. Should I be doing this? But I'm also pursuing dopamine and pleasure. That's essentially what you're pursuing in your affair when you're buying sex. What if I get caught? This woman is so different than any of the rest. She actually knows me. She sees me. So what you have to begin to connect the dots to is that there is a reenactment happening in most of our sexual behavior to these past categories. So let's go back to our three men that we started with. So Matteo grew up in a Catholic family, and his dad was gone very often on business. He had two older siblings that were pretty popular in high school, and so he was often left alone with his mom. Often. So he talked to me about they used to go to Blockbuster Video and get takeout, and he said it was kind of like I was on a date every Friday night with my mom. And she would kind of just begin to confide in him about how much it stunk that, his dad had to travel so much, but she was so grateful to have a great son that really liked her and cared for her, and said, if your dad ever dies, I'm definitely going to be the one, I'm going to move in with you and whoever you end up marrying. And so he just began to feel pretty used. And so again, you can kind of begin to see that connection of how this plays out in his present life. We're hooking up, he wants the attachment, but then he doesn't want anything to do with a woman. So that's Matteo's story. Ben's story is his father was athletic director of a high school. His mom was a dental hygienist. And a lot of what would happen in their family is that his mom was often very strict, very angry with her husband for she would basically yell over at him and say, "You're such a pathetic husband." And the husband would essentially just tune out, would turn on ESPN, would turn on golf, just didn't want to engage it. And if his wife got riled up enough, he would often become really escalated, flip over tables, flip over stuff. So Ben grew up kind of watching all of this unfold. And he often would try to take his younger siblings and he would take them down into the basement. So his parents ended up getting divorced. And then he got involved with Young Life. He got involved with a lot of different ministries. And they always kind of praised him for, you have such great leadership potential. You have, you're a really good man. But they never really began to ask him more about what was the pain that was actually happening in the divorce, being separated from his mom and his dad. And then when he got on a high school varsity basketball team, he remembers the district championship game. He forgot to box somebody out. And they got the rebound, put it back, and their team ended up losing the game. And so his coach ran out onto the floor and just said, "You pathetic loser, this loss is on you," and took the basketball and just kind of chucked it at his head. And he remembers looking over at his dad in the stands, and he had no eye contact. He was just kind of looking down. So again, Ben finds a career where so much of this strict reenactment begins to happen in commercial real estate. And if he doesn't have anywhere to process that anger and that violence, where do you think it's going to show up but in his sexual life? So that's Ben's story. Jonathan was born into a family of two lawyers. His parents were really successful. They took the first 6 months off of his life just to be with him, and then sooner or later they got a full-time nanny. And two of his earliest memories were that the first one is he remembers being about 2 or 3 and waking up in the crib all alone and trying to reach outside of the bars and trying to call for someone and no one ever coming to him. Second memory was having chicken pox, sitting with the nanny, and then watching his mom kind of roll out of the driveway and then just being just crying, wanting to be with his mom as he had chicken pox. So after that happened, Jonathan got to be in 8th grade. He was 14, and his parents decided, you don't need a nanny anymore, so we're gonna let you kind of hold down the house by yourself, which is basically a latchkey kid. And so they got him a bike basically September of his 8th grade year. And he said, I love that bike. I got on my bike and I would just ride around the neighborhood. And I remember just cruising around, and he used this language, I remember cruising around the neighborhood just trying to lock eyes with like a girl in my class to think that so that she would think I was so cool. I would lock eyes with my friends' moms just to be able to kind of get that care. And so he's using all this language. And then much later in life, or not later in life, but that same summer, the next summer, his parents did a 2-week stint for an international case, and they had a full-time nanny come into their house that was a local college student, and she basically just started asking Jonathan, have you ever kissed someone? Are you dating anyone? He's like, no, I'm not dating anyone. I've never really even kissed someone. And from that point on, she said, basically invited him to begin kissing her body later that night. And over the next 2 weeks, he had lost and had his virginity taken from him. And so this is Jonathan's story of and you can, again, begin to see the relationship between early childhood experiences of scanning and cruising to what he found. And so what I want to underscore with you guys this morning, I may have gone too far, is that none of these connections had ever occurred to any of these men when they first got into therapy. None of them. Which makes me wonder a lot about you guys. As you begin to process your own unwanted sexual behavior, be that buying sex, watching porn, having affairs, have you connected any of these stories? And what I'm asking for is not for you all to draw hard and fast conclusions of, yeah, that happened to me, but probably as I talked, there were flashes that were coming to your mind of, oh yeah, that from my son, or maybe that was like my dad, or that was my mom. And so that's really what I would want you all to kind of process within energy groups or whatnot, is to kind of begin to connect these stories. And so what I find with men is that we can say we struggle with porn, we can struggle with that, but it's so much harder for us to go back to these original stories where we had a lot of powerlessness, where we had a lot of things that don't make sense, where we have a lot of vulnerability. And so, again, that's always what I find is that whenever people have the first taste of the freedom that they're trying to seek, they realize that it's not about stopping their bad behavior, but it's actually about beginning to pursue the stories of sexual harm, of neglect, that really set up the involvement in their behavior. And so one of my favorite quotes is from Father Richard Rohr, who many of you all may know. He says this: "The pain we do not transform, we transmit. Always someone else has to suffer because I don't know how to suffer. That is what it comes down to. The pain we do not transform, we transmit. Always someone else has to suffer because I do not know how to." And that's really the work of our lives as men, is to really begin to say, where have I known harm? Where have I known pain? And if I don't transform that, if I don't grieve that, if I don't engage that, I'm going to bring a lot of pain into my own life, the lives of my family, in my marriage. And so we have to begin to really engage our harm, and we have to begin to engage our sexual struggles. And that's where I always come back to just the language of Romans 2:4, that it is the kindness of God that leads to change. And so my prayer, my hope for you guys is that you would really begin, as you begin processing your struggles, that you would begin to hear the kind and curious voice of God, who loves you,